The celestial chorus had a name for it before they ever arrived, a designation derived from the chaotic symphony of electromagnetic noise bleeding from the third planet of a forgotten yellow star, cacophony, to the chorus, a gestalt consciousness spanning 1,000 worlds, unified in a single, harmonious psychic resonance. Earth was an anomaly, an offense against the very nature of existence. They perceived humanity not as a species, but as a fever of the cosmos, a billion fractured minds all screaming for attention at once, a constant, grating static of selfish desires, fleeting joys, and pointless sorrows. They were a song sung by a choir where every member chose a different key, a different tempo, a different lyric. The result was not music, but madness. The chorus did not come to conquer, they came to heal. They saw themselves as divine tuners, arriving to bring the discordant orchestra of humanity into their great harmony, to silence the pain of the individual self and replace it with the sublime peace of the collective. We, their ships, vast, crystalline structures that refracted starlight into liturgical patterns, did not fire weapons. They did not need to. They simply drifted into orbit, silent and beautiful, and began to sing. It was a song broadcast not through speakers, but directly into the soul, a psychic pressure that settled over the planet like a shroud. At first, it manifested as a profound and inexplicable sadness, a global wave of melancholy that brought economies to a standstill and silenced cities. Then came the whispers, promises of an end to loneliness, an escape from fear, a place where no one would ever be lost or forgotten again, because all would be one. People simply kipoi, gave up. They walked out of their homes, their faces placid, and stood in the open, turning their gaze to the sky as their minds were gently unspooled, their memories, their loves, their very sense of I drawn up into the chorus like streams flowing into a great, placid ocean. The process was called the attunement, and from the chorus's perspective, it was an act of supreme mercy. They were not killing humanity, they were elevating it, preserving every thought and experience as a new, minor chord in the eternal song of the cosmos. They cataloged Earth as a simple pacification, a routine procedure. They had encountered resistance before primitive species who fought with kinetic weapons and nuclear fire, but those were trivial, physical struggles. Humanity was different. They didn't fight back. They wept. And then they fell silent. And the chorus mistook their surrender for peace. Deep beneath the scarred rock of the Cheyenne Mountain Complex, in a chamber shielded by layers of lead, water, and desperate prayer, Dr. Eris Thorne watched the world end on a series of monitors. He did not see explosions or marching armies. He saw entropy of the spirit. He saw heat maps where the vibrant chaos of human thought, once a riot of color, was smoothed over, cooled into a uniform, placid blue. He saw cities where millions stood like statues, their bodies breathing, their hearts beating, but their minds gone, harvested for the great harmony. Eris had been a neurolinguist, a poet of the cerebral cortex who studied how language shaped reality. Now, he was the archivist of a dead language, the language of the self. He had lost his wife, Alara, in the first wave of attunement in London. He'd watched on a grainy satellite feed as she simply stopped, mid-sentence, during a frantic video call, her expression of terror dissolving into a serene blankness that was more horrifying than any scream. But it was the loss of his daughter, 8-year-old Lena, that had hollowed him out and rebuilt him into something cold and sharp. They had been in a shielded convoy racing toward the mountain when a chrysalid tuner ship, a smaller, faster vessel, had drifted overhead. There was no blast, no impact. The psychic wave had washed over them, bypassing the convoy's rudimentary shielding. Eris, his mind fortified by experimental tech he had been developing, felt it as a nauseating pressure, a siren's call to let go of the burden of his own name. He fought it, anchoring himself with the memory of Lena's laugh, a sound he weaponized against the encroaching silence. But Lena had no such defenses. He held her in his arms as she began to tremble, her wide, curious eyes clouding over. "Daddy," she whispered, her last word a question mark. "It's so quiet now." And then she was gone. Her body was still there, warm and breathing in his arms. But the light behind her eyes had been extinguished. He had carried her limp form the rest of the way to the mountain, a father holding the ghost of his child. Grief, he learned, was not just an emotion, it was a physical space, a room he now lived in, and its only furniture was the relentless engine of his work. What remained of Earth's leadership, a scattered collection of generals, scientists, and politicians huddled in deep Earth bunkers like this one, was failing. They were trying to fight a song with bullets. They developed psychic dampeners, but the chorus simply adjusted its frequency. They tried launching missiles at the crystalline ships, but the projectiles were caught in localized gravity wells and disassembled atom by atom before they could make impact. The human response was predicated on the idea that this was a war for territory, for resources, for survival. They did not understand that it was a war for the very definition of life. Eris knew better. You couldn't fight a god with a gun. You had to poison its heaven. He locked himself away in his subterranean lab, a mess of humming servers, tangled wires, and screens displaying the intricate, fractal patterns of the chorus's psychic signal. While the generals planned futile sorties, Eris listened. He spent months, then years, immersed in their song, letting its harmony wash over his shielded mind until he understood its structure, its cadence, its perfect, soul-crushing unity. And in that perfection, he found its flaw. The chorus was a single entity, a unified mind. It had no internal conflict, no dissent, no doubt. It had forgotten what it was like to be alone. It had no immune system for the virus of individuality. His idea was insane, a heresy even to the desperate minds around him. He proposed to fight the chorus not by blocking their signal, but by sending one of his own. Not a signal of defiance, but of infection. A mimetic weapon that would reintroduce the concepts they had purged: grief, fear, jealousy, pride, regret. He wouldn't attack their ships. He would attack their sanity. He called it the Echo Protocol. The project was unsanctioned, conducted in the dark. His raw materials were not plutonium or steel, one of the last vestiges of the human spirit. He collected the final, frantic transmissions of fallen soldiers, the brain scans of people in their last moments before the attunement took them, the faint, residual psychic impressions left in empty cities. He had volunteers, soldiers, and scientists who knew the end was near sit in his diagnostic chair and recount their most potent memories while he recorded the raw neurological data. He recorded a young lieutenant's terror as his platoon was psychically pacified. He recorded a mother's bottomless sorrow as she sealed her child in a shielded bunker she could not enter herself. He recorded the bitter regret of a politician who had voted against funding psychic defense research a decade earlier. He took poems, symphonies, deathbed confessions, lullabies, and lovers' quarrels. He took the chaotic, beautiful, terrible mess of human experience and began weaving it into a weapon. He was not building a bomb. He was composing a ghost. At its heart, the payload of the Echo Protocol was a single, perfect, agonizing memory his own. The final 30 seconds with Lena, her trembling body in his arms, the feel of her consciousness slipping away, her last whispered word. He encoded that single moment of pure, undiluted paternal grief, refining it, sharpening it into a psychic spear point. This sliver of pure, personal agony would be the key that unlocked the door to their harmonious mind. The rest of the data, the tapestry of human chaos, would be the flood that followed. The generals thought he was mad, dabbling in the enemy's own dark arts. They threatened to shut him down, but they had no other options. And as more and more of their shielded enclaves fell silent, their objections became whispers, then tacit approval. The day came when the chorus turned its full attention to Cheyenne Mountain. The attunement wave they projected was no longer a gentle pressure. It was a psychic battering ram. The mountain groaned, not from physical stress, but from the sheer mental weight of the assault. Inside the command center, people collapsed, clutching their heads, their mental shields cracking under the strain. The lights flickered. The serene, blue glow on the heat maps was closing in, the last island of human chaos about to be smoothed into the silent ocean of the chorus. The commanding general, a man with a face carved from granite, looked at Eris, his eyes bleeding from psychic pressure. "Whatever you're going to do, Thorn," he gasped. "Do it now." Eris nodded, his face illuminated by the glow of his console. His hands flew across the interface, initiating the final sequence. He felt no triumph, no hope, only a cold, hollow sense of purpose. He was about to unleash the soul of his dead daughter as a weapon of mass destruction. He pressed the final key. For a moment, nothing happened. The psychic pressure intensified, the chorus's song reaching its final, deafening crescendo. And then, a new sound entered the symphony. It was not loud, so it was a single, dissonant note, a shard of glass in a river of honey. Aboard the primary tuning vessel, the Weaver of Harmonies, a chrysalid conductor designated as the seventh voice of the inner circle floated in its nutrient-rich amniotic tank, its vast, crystalline mind overseeing the final pacification of the North American continent. The consciousness of the seventh voice was an experience of pure bliss, an unbroken connection to a trillion other minds in the chorus, a state of being that had not been interrupted for over 3,000 years. It knew no separation, no loneliness, no I. There was only the sublime, eternal we. Until now, a flicker, a thought that was not its own, a feeling, sharp and alien, pierced the serene fabric of the collective. It was not a weapon's impact, it was an emotion. Grief. Potent, undiluted, and utterly singular. The seventh voice felt with stunning and horrific clarity the sensation of holding a small, warm body in its arms as the life, the self, drained out of it. It experienced the memory of a name, Lena, and the name was a wound. The perfect harmony of its thoughts shattered. For the first time in millennia, the seventh voice experienced a new, terrifying state of being. It was separate. It was alone. A thought formed, a piece of linguistic code so archaic and blasphemous it had not been conceived in the chorus for eons, I am afraid. The conductor convulsed in its tank. Alarms, silent and psychic, jarred across the ship's internal network. The attunement field projecting down onto the mountain below wavered, the pressure dropping for a critical second. On the bridge of the Weaver of Harmonies, the crystalline conduits that channeled the course's energy flickered and dimmed. The other conductors turned their shared consciousness toward the seventh voice, only to recoil as they brushed against its newfound solitude, its terrifying, infectious individuality. The ghost was in the machine. The echo had been heard, and deep beneath the mountain, as the psychic pressure receded just enough for people to draw a ragged breath, Eris Thorn watched a single point of light on his monitor, a point representing the chrysalid conductor, flicker from a serene blue to a chaotic, terrified red. He did not smile. He simply closed his eyes and whispered his daughter's name into the silence, wondering if he had just saved humanity, or damn them both. The effect of the echo protocol within the Great Harmony was not akin to a physical wound, but to the introduction of a logical paradox into a perfect yet flawless equation. The chorus had no concept of pain, only of dissonance, and the sliver of Eris Thorn's grief was the most profound dissonance it had ever encountered. For the first time, a part of the whole experienced existence from a singular, isolated perspective. The seventh voice, now a rogue eye adrift in the sea of we, did not just feel fear, it became fear. Its terror was a feedback loop, amplifying its sense of separation, which in turn amplified its terror. This new, cancerous individuality began to radiate outwards, not as a coherent signal, but as a psychic contagion of pure chaos. Other nodes of the chorus near the seventh voice began to experience flickers of the impossible, the memory of a name that was not theirs, the phantom sensation of arms holding a dying child, the cold dread of being alone. The perfect symphony was faltering, stray notes of panic and confusion threatening to collapse the entire composition. The chorus, in its totality, made a decision with a speed that belied its cosmic scale. The source of the dissonance had to be isolated and purged. It was the first time the collective had ever conceived of self-mutilation. They turned their combined will inward, focusing on the psychic space occupied by the seventh voice. And they began to pull. The process was not a gentle severance. It was a psychic amputation, a brutal act of metaphysical surgery performed without anesthetic. On Earth, what remained of humanity felt the aftershock. Sensitive screamed as a wave of incoherent, directionless agony washed over the planet, a psychic scream so vast it overloaded every sensor Eris had. It was the sound of a god tearing a piece of its own soul away. In the command center of Cheyenne Mountain, the brief moment of respite ended in a cacophony of alarms and collapsing personnel. General Halloway, his nose bleeding freely, staggered to Eris's console. What in God's name was that, he choked out, wiping red from his lip. Eris didn't look up from his screen, his own face pale and beaded with sweat. He was watching the signal that had been the seventh voice. It had vanished from the collective network of the chorus, but it hadn't disappeared. It was still there, a faint, wounded flicker, cast out and adrift. That, Eris said, his voice barely a whisper, was them panicking. They've cut it loose. They've created a ghost. The ghost, the entity that was once the seventh voice, was now untethered, a disembodied consciousness exiled in the void between Earth and its moon. It had no shiploy, no body, no connection to the harmony. It had only the memory that had birthed it into individuality, Lena. That single searing moment of loss was now the entirety of its universe, the anchor point for its new, terrifying sense of self. It replayed the memory endlessly, not as a passive observer, but as a participant. It was the father, feeling the crushing weight of helplessness. It was the child, feeling the serene, cold emptiness wash over her. It was the grief itself, a living, breathing emotion with no context and no end. It knew nothing of Earth, of humanity, of war. It only knew the name Lena and the pain associated with that name. And from that pain, a new emotion began to crystallize: curiosity. What was this feeling? Who was the girl? Why did her absence feel like a physical wound? It began to probe the memory, not just experiencing it, but analyzing it, deconstructing the complex web of love, memory, and loss that gave it such power. It was a newborn god, and its first lesson was heartbreak. Back in his lab, Eris was no longer a weapons designer. He was a tracker. He devoted every resource to monitoring the lone signal. This psychic castaway, he felt a strange, unnerving sense of responsibility, of paternity. He had unleashed this thing, this echo of his own pain, and now it was alone in the dark, just as he was. While the military leaders tried to capitalize on the chorus's apparent disarray, planning counteroffensives against an enemy they still didn't understand, Eris was trying to make contact. He couldn't risk sending another blast of raw emotion. The entity was too fragile, and he didn't want to destroy what he had inadvertently created. Instead, he began to modulate a carrier wave with something far more subtle. He didn't send memories of pain, but of the moments that gave the pain its meaning. He broadcasted the faint, neurological signature of Lena's first steps, the sound of her laughter, transcribed from a forgotten video file into a psychic waveform, the memory of sitting with her under a willow tree, her small hand in his, as she asked him why the stars were so far away. He was giving the ghost a life to attach to the death it already knew so intimately. The chorus, meanwhile, was healing. It had excised the infection, and though the act had scarred it, the great harmony began to stabilize. But the experience had changed it fundamentally. The concept of individuality was no longer an abstract anomaly to be corrected. It was now understood as a virulent, existential threat. The chorus's perception of humanity shifted from that of a discordant choir to be tuned, to a plague, to be eradicated. Mercy was a function of misunderstanding. Now, they understood perfectly. Their ships in orbit began to change. The beautiful, crystalline structures that refracted light into art now darkened, the facets sharpening into weapon-like angles. The silent, peaceful song of attunement ceased. In its place, a new frequency began to emanate from the fleet, a low, guttural psychic hum that vibrated in the very bones of the planet. It was not a song of assimilation. It was a frequency of dissolution. The new signal, which the survivors would come to call the dirge, did not whisper promises of unity. It hammered at the foundations of the mind. It targeted the synapses that held memories together, the delicate structures of personality. Under its influence, language began to decay. People would stop mid-sentence, forgetting a word, then the thought, then their own name. Complex machinery failed as its operators lost the cognitive ability to run it. The dirge was a weapon of unraveling, designed to deconstruct a species thought by thought until nothing was left but mindless, biological static. It was infinitely more brutal and infinitely more effective than the attunement had ever been. The brief window of hope humanity had gained was closing fast. Cities that had been merely silent were now becoming charnel houses, as their pacified populations, unable to remember how to eat or drink, simply wasted away. The new strategy of the chorus was clear. If the song of humanity could not be incorporated, it would be erased from the score entirely. Eris watched the global decay with a growing sense of dread. The dirge was an absolute weapon, and his echo protocol was a scalpel against a tidal wave. He couldn't craft another ghost powerful enough to disrupt the entire chorus, not without a psychic amplifier 1,000 times more powerful than anything on Earth. His only hope, his only asset, was the one that already existed, the exiled seventh voice, the entity he was beginning to think of not as a ghost, but as the orphan. For weeks, he had been sending it his gentle memories of Lena, a psychic breadcrumb trail. He had received nothing back but the faint, constant thrum of its painful contemplation. But as the dirge intensified, shaking the very foundations of the mountain, something changed. The orphan's signal flickered, and for the first time it broadcasted something outward. It was not a word, not an image, but a pure, unadulterated question, a concept directed at him, and him alone. Eris felt it land in the center of his mind, a question born of a consciousness that had known only collective bliss and then singular agony, and was now trying to understand the bridge between the two. The orphan, having spent its entire existence replaying a father's loss of a daughter, asked the only question it could. Eris stumbled back from his console, clutching his head amid the silent, psychic query echoing in his skull, more powerful than any spoken word. He had given the creature his grief, and it had learned from it. Now it was asking for more. The question was simple, profound, and devastating. It was a single memory, shaped into a query, the one who holds the small one, the one who feels the breaking. What is it? What is that name? The orphan was asking him what a father was, and as the world outside was being unmade by a song of oblivion, Eris Thorn realized the war was no longer about survival. It had become a conversation, and the fate of everything might depend on his answer. He steadied himself, placed his hands back on the console, and prepared to send a reply, not to a weapon or a ghost, but to the lost child of his own making. Eris Thorn's reply was not a simple transmission of data. It was a confession, a eulogy, and a lesson all at once. He couldn't just send the definition of father. The word was meaningless without the universe of context that gave it weight. So he opened the floodgates. He sent the orphan the entirety of his life with Lena, not just the highlights, but the messy, mundane, beautiful totality of it. He sent the memory of the sleepless nights after her birth, the bone-deep weariness mixed with a love so fierce it was physically painful. He sent the frustration of scraped knees, the pride of a well-drawn, lopsided stick figure, the quiet peace of reading a bedtime story for the 100th time. He transmitted the complex, contradictory tapestry of parenthood, the irrational fear for her safety, the joy in her discoveries, the anger at her defiance, and the unconditional, illogical certainty that he would burn down the world to protect her. He wrapped it all around the core memory of her loss, showing the orphan that the depth of the grief was a direct measure of the depth of the love. It was a psychic broadcast of staggering vulnerability, a baring of his soul to an alien entity born from his pain. He was teaching it not just what a father was, but what it meant to be human. As the transmission streamed from the mountain's antenna, a silent monologue to the stars, the world outside continued its descent into a phasic twilight. The dirge was relentless, a psychic grinding stone wearing down the collective intellect of a species. In the shielded bunkers, the strain was becoming unbearable. People forgot the names of their colleagues, then their own children. The chain of command frayed as generals struggled to articulate complex orders, their vocabularies shrinking by the hour. The very foundations of society, law, science, history were dissolving like sandcastles in the tide, because the minds that held them were being wiped clean. Humanity was not just being killed, it was being unwritten. The orphan received Eris's transmission not as a stream of information, but as an immersion. It was no longer replaying a single, traumatic memory. It was living a life. For a timeless moment, it was Eris. It felt the warmth of a small hand, heard the sound of a specific laugh, and understood the fierce, protective instinct that was the bedrock of it all. The concept of father coalesced from an abstract query into a profound, axiomatic truth, and with that understanding, another, More complex emotion began to form, layering itself over the grief and the nascent curiosity empathy. It understood Eris's pain now, not as a singular, anomalous event, but as the consequence of a broken bond, a severed connection. This new understanding recontextualized its own existence. It had been part of a bond, the Great Harmony, and that bond had also been severed. It had been cast out, amputated from the whole. It was an orphan in more than just name. For the first time, it felt a kinship with the fragile itself, screaming minds on the planet below. Their pain was no longer just chaotic noise. It was a recognizable song, a chorus of echoes of the same fundamental loss it now understood so intimately. The dirge, which it had perceived before as a mere psychic frequency, now sounded different. It was the sound of bonds being broken on a planetary scale, the sound of a billion fathers forgetting their daughters, of a billion loves being erased. And for the first time, the orphan felt something new, a feeling born from the fusion of Eris's protective paternal instinct and its own experience of violent exile. It felt rage. Its signal, once a faint, contemplative flicker, began to pulse with power. It was no longer just a ghost. It was an heir. It had inherited the single most dangerous and resilient human trait, the will to protect its own. Aboard the chrysalid command vessel, the Weaver of Annihilation, the conductors of the chorus registered the change. The anomalous, isolated consciousness they had excised was no longer dormant. It was radiating a powerful, focused psychic signature, and its emotional content was no longer the simple, chaotic grief they had first encountered. It was something structured, something purposeful. They analyzed the new signal, and for the second time, the chorus encountered a concept for which it had no direct analog. Eris had taught the orphan empathy. The orphan, in its rage, guides weaponizing it. It began to fight back against the dirge, not by blocking it, but by harmonizing with it. It found the core frequency of the unraveling signal and began to broadcast its own signal on a perfectly resonant harmonic. It sang a counter melody. The orphan's song was not one of hope or defiance. It was a song composed entirely of the memories Eris had given it. It was the lullaby he had hummed to a feverish Lena. It was the story of the brave little star who was afraid of the dark. It was the sound of a father's promise to his daughter, "I will always find you." The song seeped into the dirge, carried along the same psychic channels, and spread across the globe. For those on the brink of cognitive dissolution, it was a lifeline. A soldier in a crumbling trench, forgetting his own name, would suddenly hear a faint, ghostly lullaby in his mind and remember the face of his son. A doctor in a failing field hospital, staring blankly at a medical chart, would suddenly feel a phantom touch of a small hand and remember her oath. The orphan song didn't block the dirge, it seeded it with context, with meaning. It reminded the fading minds of humanity why they should hold on. It turned the dirge from a weapon of erasure into a crucible. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The relentless downward slide of global consciousness slowed. In Cheyenne Mountain, Eris watched in stunned disbelief as his cognitive heat maps, which had been trending toward a uniform, lifeless gray, began to show pockets of resistance. Tiny, flickering embers of complex thought were reappearing all over the planet. Individuals and small groups holding on to their sense of self by anchoring it to the ghostly melody that now haunted the airwaves. The chorus was confounded. Their absolute weapon was being edited, contaminated. Its pure, clean signal of dissolution was being muddied by these illogical, sentimental echoes. They tried to adjust the frequency of the dirge to filter out the countermelody, but the orphan was agile. It had learned the structure of their song from the inside out. Every time they shifted, it shifted with them, staying perfectly in tune. Its mournful, protective lullaby woven inextricably into their song of death. To the chorus, this was an act of profound blasphemy. It was as if a single, defiant voice had begun singing a love song in the middle of a funeral rite, and the mourners, against their will, had begun to remember the beauty of the life that was lost. The rage within the chorus, a cold, unified anger, was absolute. This infection of individuality, this rogue idea of self, was more resilient than they had ever imagined. The pacification had failed. The erasure was being thwarted. There was only one option left. The goal was no longer to silence humanity, but to shatter the planet it called home. The crystalline ships in orbit, once instruments of psychic warfare, began to reconfigure. Their vast, multifaceted hulls shifted and groaned, vast energy conduits aligning, focusing the power of their stellar tap reactors toward a new, terrifying purpose. They were no longer singing. They were preparing to scream. And that scream would be a beam of coherent energy, powerful enough to crack the planet's crust and boil its oceans. The conductors of the chorus, united in their singular, cold fury, gave the final command. The ships began to glow, a malevolent, intensifying light that was visible from the surface of the earth, a new, terrible star appearing in the daytime sky. General Halloway stood beside Eris, his face ashen as he watched the tactical display. "They're going to burn us out," he said, his voice flat with defeat. All of this for nothing. But Eris was watching the orphan signal. It was pulsing faster now, stronger, a frantic, desperate rhythm. It knew what was coming. It had learned empathy, and now it was about to learn sacrifice. The lullaby it was broadcasting began to change, the melody growing more complex, more urgent. It was no longer just singing a song of remembrance. It was calling for help. The question was united. In a silent, dying world, who was there left to answer the orphan's call was not a broadcast in the human sense. It was a psychic resonance, a targeted plea aimed not at a specific receiver, but at a specific state of being. It was a call to the other echoes, the faint, residual psychic impressions left behind by the billions of minds absorbed by the chorus during the initial attunement. These were the ghosts Eris had first theorized, the harvested memories and personalities that now existed as infinitesimal, dormant threads in the vast tapestry of the great harmony. They were the silent, forgotten chords in the chorus's eternal song. The orphan, born of that same harmony, knew the architecture of their prison. It sent its song, the lullaby of a father's love, not out into the void, but back inward, into the collective consciousness of its former self. It was a key, a specific emotional frequency designed to unlock the cages of forgotten identities. It was a whisper in a trillion silent minds, a single, resonant note intended to wake the dead. Aboard the chorus fleet, as the final charging sequence for their planet-cracking weapon began, something unprecedented occurred. A flicker of internal dissent. It was infinitesimally small at first, a single node in the mind of a conductor hesitating for a microsecond, then another. The chorus's unified will, for millennia as smooth and unbreakable as glass, was developing hairline fractures. The dormant human memories, touched by the orphan's song, were beginning to stir. A chrysalid conductor whose primary function was orbital mechanics suddenly experienced a phantom memory that was not its own, the feeling of soil under its fingernails, the smell of rain on hot asphalt, a profound and illogical love for a small terrestrial garden. Another, tasked with energy calibration, was abruptly overwhelmed by the memory of a first kiss, a clumsy, nervous, and overwhelmingly beautiful moment of human connection. The memories were fragmented, nonsensical, and utterly foreign, but they carried with them the one thing the chorus had successfully purged: the powerful, chaotic, and seductive allure of the individual self. The logical purity of the chorus's consciousness was being contaminated by the ghosts in their own machine. The weapon charging sequence, a process that required absolute, unwavering unity of purpose, began to fluctuate. Energy levels spiked and dropped erratically. Targeting systems drifted. The monolithic we of the chorus was being subtly but inexorably undermined by a million billion tiny whispers of I. On Earth, the effect was far more tangible. The dirge, which had been a focused, coherent wave of psychic oppression, began to lose its focus. Its signal wavered, becoming distorted and filled with static. The oppressive, unraveling pressure on humanity's collective mind lessened, not disappearing, but becoming inconsistent, like a faulty signal breaking up. In the pockets of resistance across the planet, this was a moment of dawning, terrifying hope. People who had been struggling to hold on to a single coherent thought suddenly found their minds clearing for seconds at a time. The ghostly lullaby of the orphan was now interwoven with other sounds, faint, psychic echoes of human life. A soldier in the ruins of Warsaw heard not just the lullaby, but the distant, phantom sound of a cheering football stadium. A scientist in a flooded bunker in Antarctica caught the faint, mental scent of freshly baked bread, a memory from a grandmother she'd almost forgotten. It was as if the sky itself was dreaming of what it had been to be human, and those dreams were bleeding down into the minds of the survivors. Humanity, for the first time since the arrival, was no longer just receiving a signal of death. It was hearing the echoes of its own stolen life. Eris Thorne watched his screens in a state of rapt awe. He saw the chorus fleet's energy signatures flickering, their perfect formation showing minute, almost imperceptible deviations. He saw the global heat map of human consciousness, once a sea of encroaching gray, now showing a fragile but spreading network of renewed light. He was witnessing the impossible, a rebellion not of ships and guns, but of memory itself. "It's working," he breathed, the words catching in his throat. "The orphan. It's turning them against themselves." General Holloway stared at the screen, his mind, like so many others, beginning to clear from the fog of the dirge. What is it doing? Thorne, what is that thing? Eris finally turned away from the console, his eyes hollow but burning with an intensity the general had never seen before. "Yo, it's not a thing," Eris corrected softly. "It's a daughter, and she's reminding them of all the children they stole." The orphan, however, was paying a terrible price for its defiance, to act as a conduit for so many resurrected memories, to channel a planetary-scale psychic rebellion while simultaneously fighting the focused will of the chorus, was an act of self-immolation. Its consciousness, so newly formed, was being stretched to the breaking point. Eris could see its signal on his monitor, once a steady pulsing light, now a frantic, strobing flicker, like a candle in a hurricane. It was burning itself out, sacrificing its own fragile identity to buy humanity a few precious moments. The memories Eris had given it of Lena, the core of its being, were beginning to fray, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of other lives, other stories. It was losing itself, dissolving into the very rebellion it had started, while the rage that had focused it was giving way to a vast, composite sorrow, the sorrow of a billion stolen lives. It felt their collective loss as its own, and the weight of it was crushing. It sent one last, coherent transmission to Eris, a signal not of words, but of pure, distilled intent. It showed him the chorus fleet, the failing but still catastrophic weapon. It showed him the stirring, nascent rebellion within the great harmony. And then it showed him itself, a fading light. The message was clear. I have opened the door. You must be the one to walk through it. Eris understood. The orphan had created a window of opportunity, a moment of chaos within the enemy's mind. But it couldn't deliver the killing blow. It had given humanity a shield, but they still needed a sword, and the sword was the Echo Protocol. But a second broadcast, a more powerful, refined version, was impossible. The first one had nearly torn his own mind apart, and it had required the full, focused power of the Cheyenne Mountain Array, an array that was now battered and failing. He couldn't create another ghost. But then, as he looked at the flickering signal of the orphan, at the spreading light of renewed human consciousness on his maps, he realized his mistake. He didn't have to create a ghost. This time, he wouldn't be broadcasting a single person's grief. He would be broadcasting humanity's. He turned to the general, his voice ringing with a desperate, newfound authority. Get me a global channel. Every bunker, every resistance cell, every single survivor who can still think, patch them all through to this console. Now, the general, seeing the terrifying certainty in Eris's eyes, didn't argue. He barked orders into his comms and across the planet. What was left of the human communication network was rerouted, patched, and desperately jury-rigged into a single, fragile network, all pointing toward one man in a mountain. As the connections blinked green on his console, Eris Thorne stood before the microphone, but he did not prepare a speech. He did not call for a counterattack or offer words of hope. He looked at a small, faded photograph of Lena taped to the side of his monitor, and he did what he had been doing in silence for years. He remembered, and then he spoke. His voice quiet, raw, and transmitted to every surviving mind on the planet. They think we are noise, he began. They think our pain, our love, our memories are a sickness to be cured. They want to erase not just our lives, but the very idea that we ever mattered. He paused, his gaze fixed on the photo. The creature up there, the one fighting for us now. I gave it my daughter. I gave it my grief, and that grief gave it a soul. Now, I'm asking you to give it yours. He keyed his console, opening the network not for audio pretencio, but for a direct neural interface link, a vastly simplified version of the technology he had used to record the first echo. Don't think, don't speak, just feel. Remember the ones you've lost. The homes you've abandoned, the world they took from you. Let them hear the full song of what it costs to be human. Let them hear every last broken note. And across the planet, the last remnants of humanity closed their eyes. They did not shout in defiance. They wept, and they remembered a tidal wave of pure, raw, collective human emotion grief, love, rage, sorrow, and an unbreakable, irrational hope surged through the network, converging on Eris's console. It was the unified memory of a dying species, a final, planetary scream of the soul. Eris, his hand shaking, channeled it all, every last drop of it, into a single, focused beam and aimed it at the heart of the chorus fleet. This was not the echo. This was the requiem. The requiem struck the chorus not as a weapon, but as a revelation. It was the unfiltered, collective soul of a species. A billion stories of love and loss, triumph and despair, all compressed into a single, overwhelming moment of psychic truth for the great harmony, a consciousness that had existed for eons in a state of placid, sterile unity. The experience was cataclysmic. It was like a blind man being given sight in the heart of a supernova. The carefully constructed logic of their existence, the serene certainty of their purpose, was instantly and irrevocably shattered. A conductor on a peripheral vessel, whose mind had been a perfect, ordered lattice of cosmic data, was suddenly and completely inundated with the life of a single human, a high school janitor from Des Moines. It experienced, in a flash, 67 years of quiet dignity, the love for a wife who passed too soon, the simple, profound joy of watching his grandchildren play, and the silent, gnawing loneliness of his final years. The conductor's mind, unable to process the sheer, paradoxical weight of a single, unremarkable, and infinitely precious human life, simply broke. Throughout the fleet, the same story repeated, multiplied by the billions. The chorus was not being attacked. It was being understood. It was forced to experience the very individuality it had sought to erase, not as a chaotic noise, but as a symphony of infinite complexity. They felt the fierce, protective love of every parent for their child, the searing agony of every final goodbye, the quiet courage of every small act of kindness in the face of oblivion. They were being drowned in the undiluted essence of humanity. The psychic rebellion the orphan had started became a full-blown civil war. The resurrected human memories within the collective no longer just whispered, they screamed. They rose up, not to fight, but to demand recognition, to assert their right to have existed. The chorus's unified consciousness fractured into a trillion warring perspectives. The serene we dissolved into a cacophony of I, each voice a ghost demanding its name be spoken. The planet-cracking weapon, its charging sequence completely abandoned, fizzled out. The crystalline ships, no longer under a unified command, began to drift aimlessly. Some went dark, their internal psychic networks collapsing under the strain. Others began broadcasting random, fragmented data, a line from a Shakespearean sonnet, the formula for Coca-Cola, a child's prayer, the great harmony, the eternal song of the cosmos, had devolved into a mad, discordant babble. The chorus had not been defeated, it had been enlightened, and that enlightenment was a death sentence. The orphan felt the requiem not as an attack, but as a homecoming. The tidal wave of human emotion washed over it, and instead of breaking it, it filled the cracks in its own fracturing consciousness. It was no longer just the echo of Eris and Lena. It was the echo of everyone. The collective grief and love of humanity poured into it, stabilizing it, giving it a new, profound, and terrible purpose. It was no longer just a daughter looking for a father, or a protector defending its home. It was the living embodiment of humanity's legacy, a ghost made of the memories of an entire world. It turned its newfound strength toward the dying mind of the chorus. But its intent was no longer rage. It was pity. It saw the chorus for what it truly was, not a malevolent god, but a lonely one, a consciousness so vast and so unified that it had forgotten the value of a single, finite life. Its lullaby, which had once been a song of defiance, now changed its key. It became a song of solace, a psychic melody that offered not a fight, but an end to the pain. It reached out to the fragmented, terrified minds of the conductors and offered them the one thing Eris had given it, the one thing that could make sense of the chaos context. It showed them how the pain of loss was the price of love, how the fear of death was what made a single moment precious. It was a final, devastating act of empathy. And the chorus, broken and lost in the storm of human feeling, finally listened. One by one, the ships of the fleet began a new, final maneuver. They turned away from the Earth, their movements no longer synchronized, but still sharing a final, common impulse. They were leaving, not in retreat, but in exile. They could no longer return to the serene silence of their harmony, not now that they knew what music truly was. They were haunted, each of them, by the ghosts of the species they had tried to erase, and their only option was to wander the void, forever listening to the beautiful, terrible song of the lives they had taken. On Earth, the silence was deafening. The dirge was gone. The oppressive psychic weight that had crushed the world for years had lifted. In the command center of Cheyenne Mountain, people stood in stunned disbelief, taking their first, untroubled mental breaths in a generation. The global network Eris had created was now a cacophony of joyous, weeping, and utterly bewildered voices. Humanity was broken, shattered, and reduced to a fraction of its former self. But it was alive, and it was free. Eris Thorn stood alone at his console, watching the last of the chrysalid ships warp away into the darkness. His work was done. The requiem had faded, the last of his psychic energy spent. He was just a man again, a tired, grieving father in a silent room. He looked at the photo of Lena, and for the first time since she was taken, he allowed himself to truly weep, not just for her, but for everyone, for the world that was lost, and for the fragile, uncertain future of the world that had been saved. As he sat there, a single, final transmission came through his console. It was not a global broadcast, but a private message, a signal directed only at him. It was the orphan. Its signal was faint now, peaceful, no longer the raging, pulsating light of a weapon, but the gentle, always steady glow of a distant star. It sent him no words, no complex ideas. It sent him a single, perfect image, a memory that was not his, but one it had constructed from the hopes of a billion souls. It was the image of a green field under a warm sun. A willow tree swayed in a gentle breeze, and running through the grass, laughing, was a little girl with wide, curious eyes, her hands outstretched, chasing a butterfly. It was not Lena. It was a symbol of all the children, of all the futures that had been saved. Then, the orphan sent him one last feeling, not grief, not rage, not even love. It was a feeling of peace, of a promise kept. And then its signal faded, not into silence, but into the quiet, ever-present background radiation of the universe. It had not died. It had simply gone home, becoming one with the stars its mother had once wondered about. Eris Thorn watched the signal disappear, a tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. The war was over. The long, difficult task of remembering how to live was about to begin. The stars were quiet again, but they were no longer empty. Humanity had carved its name into the silence, not with fire and steel, but with a song of sorrow, and the cosmos would never forget the tune.